Faculty of Education, and our is this our first, maybe, of the colloquium series for this year. My name's Anne Sherman, and I'm the dean here at the faculty, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here, and to introduce our speaker. But just before I do that, I'm going to tell you that following Alan's talk, you're welcome to a reception in room 225, just down the stairs and to the right. It says Faculty Lounge on it. And because we're live streaming tonight's talk, if you do have to duck out for a minute, we're hoping that you'll go up the stairs and out the back door, and it'll stay open so you can get back in, just so that you don't get to be too much part of the movie, as it were. And I also want to say, because I will forget at the end, that our next one will take place on November 13th. We have an international Indigenous scholar coming from New York, Dr. Eve Tuck. She is a woman who is a member of an Alaskan tribal group and is a well-known author about issues to do with research in First Nations communities, with First Nations communities. She has very interesting writing about the need to suspend damage. She says that a lot of research that we do involving First Nations people ends up portraying them as broken or depleted, and that we need to find other ways to portray all the strengths that we find in those communities. So she'll be here Thursday, November 13th, downstairs in room 143. So it's open to the public again. We'll be sending posters out and hope that you'll join us then. We're going to try to do these about once a month and have a mix of our own scholars with other invited scholars. So we're thrilled tonight to start the series with Dr. Alan Sears. Alan has been here for a few years. Alan was here, well, he was technically
28
here.
years.
28 years. So he was here when I was the master's student. But he was away doing his PhD, so he's much smarter than me. He's way ahead of me there. But he and I connected over the years through other mutual colleagues, and I've been very, very fortunate to work with him both before I got here and since I've been here as the dean. He is one of those foundational members of the faculty that everybody turns to. How do we do this? Alan will know. How do we get this done? Alan will know. He's served academic, or not just in academic roles here, but also in administrative roles. And so he's a very valuable member of the faculty and is a real citizen of the faculty, if I can use that as a little segue into the topic. A social studies teacher, he has become very interested and well known internationally for his work on citizenship education, education about democracy, how we engage students in schools, kids of all ages, and their teachers in ways of thinking about the aspects of citizenship and democracy that really matters in school. So it's with real pleasure that I welcome Dr. Alan Sears.
So to tell you how old I was, I like better the reception I got leaving the building yesterday, and a former PhD student was talking with Linda Arrow front, and I was leaving to walk home with my backpack on and my sneakers, and she said my backpack on and my sneakers look very youthful. So,
You are.
And I know how things are done by virtue of the fact I've been here a long time. I'm not sure it's any great wisdom, but I do appreciate being here tonight and having this opportunity. I just finished a book chapter, in fact, which I'm not going to talk about tonight. But I'm working on a book about the nation in the context of globalization and how the nation is taught or conceptualized in schooling. And so as part of the chapter, I was writing about the idea of Canada as a multinational state, which is pretty well accepted in political science these days and more accepted in the curriculum. And so just to acknowledge Canada's multinational nature here tonight, that this is a territory that is traditional Maliseet territory, the Maliseet Nation in Fredericton, and that the French had quite a presence here as well. before English settlers showed up. So this has been a multinational territory all along. So we have very complex citizenships here in New Brunswick, and it continues to be a complex place to live as citizens, as I hope we'll talk about tonight. It's really interesting to have me coming in here and getting a talk about measurement, which is something I know almost nothing about, but, as you might find out over the course. But I want to start by introducing you to Emil Cohen. In 2010, Emil was a student at Northern Secondary School in Toronto. And Emil is like Dave Wagner, my colleague, a soccer player, a football player. And Emil had been pretty discouraged about his school's lack of commitment to soccer. Over the years that he'd been at the school, over the 3 years, there'd been no team one year because they just couldn't find a coach willing to work with the kids. The next year there was a team, but the coach quit just before the playoffs and left the team unable to compete in the playoffs. And the year in 2010, Emil and a couple of friends from the men's soccer team had cajoled a parent into coaching and then gone around the school because you need to have a teacher sponsor at least if there's a parent coach to find an extra a teacher to sponsor the team. And they found a team, and they had a team that went through the season for the first time in 3 years. And so Emil was invited at the end of this term in December of 2010. They had a sports banquet, and they had parents and the students there, athletes there, members of the community who had sponsored the sports team, and every team was invited to have someone give a little talk about the team, a student give a talk about the team, and Emil was given the task of giving a talk about the soccer team at the banquet. And here's the talk Emil gave. This year, the soccer season was one that easily surpassed the expectations of everyone involved with the team. Admittedly, these expectations were extremely low due to the 3 years of abject failure that we have been subjected to through no fault of our own. We now have it instilled into us that soccer at Northern is synonymous with the word unnecessary. We had at this point made clearly to us this season when our last 2 home games were moved to Forest Hill to allow the football team more field time. And that wasn't to play a game, that was to practice, right? Their game was moved for the football team's practice. Nevertheless, we had a team this year due to the tenacity and perseverance of several players who took it upon themselves to do the phys ed department's job to find a coach. Now, there was more to the speech, but at this point it ended. Emil was cut off by the teachers at the bank at the thing, and the upshot was the next day he found out he was suspended for 2 days and barred from all sporting activity at the school for a year. I might point out that this all occurs in the context of a province that had engaged in active citizenship at the center of its social studies curriculum, and in fact at the center of its provincial mandate for education. If you read the poster for tonight, the new mission statement for education in Ontario puts citizenship, engaged, active citizenship at the very center. And Emil was suspended for 2 days for making a speech. I know about this, not because I know Emil or have any special connection to him, but because it hit the press. But not only is it a province that puts citizenship at the center of its curriculum, we're in a context where more and more, and including in Ontario, Ontario has a student voice initiative, as do several provinces. In fact, I brought with me tonight, some of you, if you've been in our lounge lately, you've seen the new issue of Education Today, it's called. It's a magazine from Ontario. And it just so happens to feature on the back page an article called Student Voice, the value of student trustees, and it features the student trustees. I actually think this is pretty much a sham. That's what I'm here to tell you tonight. That schools are not interested in student voice unless that voice is compliant and controlled. And that's just one way in which I think that citizenship is not taken seriously as an outcome of schooling. Stephen Lewis said it this way about at a conference on democratic education a few years ago, that the democracy they are absorbing ridicules the democracy they being students that they are observing. And they know that. These are lessons that these kids learn. I'm currently engaged in a SSHRC-funded research project to look at how 18-year-olds understand democratic participation. So we have surveyed 2,000 grade 12 students, 1,000 in the Maritimes and 1,000 in Alberta, and followed up with qualitative interviews. And one of the things we talk to them about is how can you make change? How can you affect difference in your communities, wherever those communities could be? And we talk to them a lot about student government. And over and over and over again, the students tell us that, in fact, in Alberta, about 60% of the schools do not have elected student government. At least that 60% of the students who responded to our survey said that they had no elected student government in their school. But maybe Alberta is just being more honest, because even in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, the students that we interviewed told us that when they had student government, it was pretty much a sham. That it was, in fact, one of the schools where I did interviews, the student government didn't have an election. The officers were picked by the school administration. And so one of the questions I asked to the young people when I was talking to them, well, if there was a rule, if there was a policy, if there was a concern in your school that you had, and you wanted to make change, what would you do? How would you go about it? And most of them said something like, we have no idea. There doesn't seem to be a mechanism for us to have voice in the school. The most optimistic of the students said something like, we can find a teacher we can trust, we can tell that teacher, and sometimes that teacher will take it forward. And so students were very discouraged about it. And it put me in mind of a movie that I saw a few years ago, a movie called Crimson Tide. I don't know if you saw the movie Crimson Tide. It's a great thriller. It features Denzel Washington and his name's harder than my
Gene Hackman.
Yeah, Gene Hackman. And Gene Hackman is the captain of an American nuclear submarine. And Denzel Washington is his first mate. And they received, and it's just like kind of ripped from the headlines, because Russia is causing problems in Eastern Europe. And tensions are rising between Russia and the United States, and both countries go on full alert with their nuclear arsenal. And they're on this nuclear submarine, and they receive an order to launch their weapons, to start World War III. And the submarine starts to sink at this point, and is under attack from Russian airplanes, and they begin to receive a second message, but their aerial is shot off, and they don't get it. And it might be the message to delay the order to start World War III, or it might be the message to continue it, and they don't know. And so there's this great debate between Gene Hackman as the captain and Denzel Washington as the first officer. And here's how the captain ends the debate.
We're here to preserve democracy, not to practice it.
We're here to preserve democracy, not practice it. And I think the motto for schooling in Canada should be, we're here to teach about democracy, not practice it. That by way of introduction. So what I would like to do tonight in this talk is to talk to you about, to make and substantiate the claim that we do not take citizenship seriously as an outcome of schools. The lack of student voice in schools is only one of the measures that I will talk about tonight, the fact that we don't. I want to introduce the project called Measuring What Matters, which is why I'm here. It's a project by a group in Ontario called People for Education, which is a civil society group, a lobby group, a think tank that focuses on educational issues in Ontario. Tries to bring them to the fore and encourage public discussion about them. And I want to pose some initial steps. This is where I am in fear and trepidation for measuring, for assessing progress in citizenship in schools. How might we do this? And I do this with fear and trepidation, wandering into this. Some of my colleagues will be ready to lynch me, I think, for getting into the idea that we might want to measure and report on measures of something like this, because that's a pretty toxic thing in schools today. The first thing I want to talk about is the fact that we don't take citizenship very seriously. A number of years ago, several colleagues and I engaged in a comparison of citizenship education policy and practice in 4 democracies, very similar democracies, Australia, England, the United States, and Canada. And we looked at what are the components that make for successful curriculum implementation and the development of sustainable and substantial programs. And we identified 7 elements, and we looked across those countries to see what those elements are. I'm not going to talk in detail of them, but the first one you'll see there is a national discussion or debate. Britain does this in the late 1990s by appointing Sir Bernard Crick, who is a prominent political scientist, to lead a panel, a very, you call it a blue ribbon panel of significant folks, to do a national set of hearings around what should we teach people about citizenship? How would we foster citizenship in schooling? which ends up in a major white paper that is very public, and then finally ends up as a curriculum order in 2001 establishing citizenship as part of the English national curriculum, right? So that's one way to foster national discussion. All of the other countries have had national discussion, except we have no national discussion about any educational issue in Canada, and it's a travesty in my view. The federal government ducks it by claiming it's a provincial responsibility and then pours millions of dollars into it in all kinds of ways. One of them is the standardized tests that we see. The PISA tests, for example, that cause all kinds of angst, are at least half funded by the federal government. That's one of the ways the federal government has a massive influence in education in Canada, but politicians, and there's one here tonight, so I want to pick on him, love to limit their policy briefs to the areas for which they're responsible, because they get brief for those areas. And if you can limit them and blame them on another politician, that's great. So we don't have national discussion about anything, and we ought to have national discussion about lots of things in education. There'll be a federal election next fall, and almost nothing will be said about public schools. And I think that's a mistake. And I am not advocating for a constitutional change that would give the federal government legislative authority in education. You don't need that to do this. There is no constitutional prohibition in the federal government being involved in areas of provincial responsibility. And in fact, it's not a matter of the federal government being involved or not involved. They are into it up to their eyeballs. They're into citizenship education up to their eyeballs, but it's covert. And it would be much better if it was open. It's not unproblematic, but that's just one of the elements that we don't take very seriously. The others includes establishing clear goals, developing curriculum materials, teacher development, which is one where Canada is way behind. We'll talk more detail about that. Adequate funding, an implementation strategy, and research and development to monitor, to think about how are things going, what's happening in schools. What we found in the end, I won't read this to you, you can read it to yourselves, but essentially is that it's an area of pretty low priority in most places, to be honest. Most of these elements of things are kind of sporadically put into place, if at all. But Canada lags far behind the other three countries in almost every area. I wanted to talk tonight too a little bit anecdotally, because these are kind of the official mechanisms by which I measure that we don't take citizenship very seriously. We have a high rhetorical commitment to citizenship. It's in every mission statement of every province across the country. If you go and listen to panels, people will always say we're fostering citizenship in schools. But the truth is, in New Brunswick, we give it almost no curricular time, especially at elementary school. We provide almost no materials. We had no elementary school curriculum for years in social studies, the primary area responsible for citizenship. And we do no teacher in-service development, just virtually none. While one of the research projects I'm involved with now is on how teachers and students understand ethnic diversity. And interviewing teachers, we asked them, how well prepared were you before you got in pre-service to work in this area? And how about in-service education? And one teacher sums it up very well. She said, in 25 years of teaching, I don't remember one workshop made available to me in this area. A number of them have done things on their own. But 2 weeks ago, I get a call from a friend who's an excellent math and science teacher, who's been assigned to teach social studies. Ironically, the grade 7 social studies curriculum titled Empowerment. We can talk about that word all we like, but the focus is supposed to be on civic action, on civic engagement. And she has no background in the area, and she is assigned to teach it. Now, she's, from my perspective, she's doing the right thing. She called me. But she turns to a colleague in the school and says she's worried about this because this isn't her area of expertise. It's not her area of background. And the colleague says to her, don't worry about it, it's only social studies. And that's a very common thing, right? We don't test it. We don't assess it. We don't report on it. We don't panic about it the way we panic about mathematics scores or literacy scores. And there's all these ways in which we don't take the subject seriously. Enter people for education and measuring what matters. I got a call last spring from Charles Ungerleider, who is a former professor of mine. He was a professor of mine when I did my PhD at UBC. Charles is one of the academics I admire most in the world because he kind of took a risk. He left UBC and became Deputy Minister of Education for a period in the Glenn Clark government in British Columbia. We love to snipe from up here in the ivory tower, and I've just been doing that, telling all the policymakers and programmers how they get it all wrong. I'm going to talk about myself in a little while, all the way that we failed this particular area of the curriculum. And Charles was willing to step out and try to help make and implement policy as a deputy minister. You know the history of BC, the Glenn Clark government is long gone, and Charles went with it, but has stayed involved in education and is co-chairing this project. And this is a project that People for Education wants to say that there are things we should measure in school that we should take seriously beyond literacy and numeracy, and especially literacy and numeracy very narrowly conceived, the way they often are by standardized tests. And so they have developed this project and put together a secretariat, which are team leaders in several areas. One is citizenship, and I'm the team leader for citizenship. One is well-being. One is mental health. One is positive learning environment. One is creativity. Some of you, my colleagues here, would know Rena Eupitis from Queens, the music teacher and arts scholar who's leading that particular area. So Charles called me and asked me if I could do this, and as nervous as I am about measurement, I'd love to try. So what I want to talk to you about tonight, for the rest of the time tonight, is my attempts to think about what it is we might assess or measure, and how, if we wanted to take seriously. I mean, we're going to focus on citizenship in school. In principle, I think we should try to figure out how it's going. I don't object to that. I want to do that in a way that's not so toxic for teachers and school systems and schools in the way that some of the reporting of standardized testing has been. So I'm a little bit nervous about that. But I've got involved in the project, and I wanted to talk to you about some of my thinking about how to move this forward. First, just to set the context a little bit, I want to talk about there's a global consensus across the democratic world, at least, and you'd be surprised that some of the world that we might not call democratic shares this consensus about the need for reform in citizenship education. And one of the elements of that consensus is a sense of crisis, or I would say overlapping crises. We're panicked about the crisis of ignorance, alienation, and agnosticism. Young students, particularly young citizens, don't know what they need to know to be good citizens. They don't care much about that. They're disengaged from that, and they're agnostic about civic values. Now, hear me. I've written extensively about how I think this is off base, right? I think there are flaws in this whole argument. For example, this is a very deficit-based argument, right? The citizens have issues, right? They're disengaging. They have issues. The system's fine. But when we talk to young people about why, let me give you an example of a student we interviewing as part of our project on democratic participation, and he picks out a picture of someone voting. So I said, what's going on there? This is a young man who's ignorant, alienated, and agnostic, right? He says, well, that's the person voting. I said, well, tell me about voting. Well, he said, voting is a central act in a democracy. It's the way democratic places choose their leadership. Oh, is it important? Yeah, it's very important. If you don't vote, my dad says, if you don't vote, you don't get a say. And he said, people had to fight for the right to vote, you know. Women had to fight for the right to vote. He said, I know some minorities had to fight for the right to vote. Yeah, it's really important. And I said to him, are you going to vote when you're 18? No. Now, we do continue. We don't stop there. We explore the future further. Actually, a very thoughtful kid, right? And belies the stereotypes. And some of the reasons that he is not going to vote are reasons we hear articulated by politicians and by the public every day about the nature of the political system. Anybody know how many people voted in Scotland? What percentage of the electorate turned out to vote in Scotland, the referendum? 85%, 84 point something percent. It is the highest voter turnout since universal suffrage in the United Kingdom in 1918. Highest ever. If you give something, if somebody thinks that things might be different tomorrow, and by the way, 95% of people voted in the Quebec referendum in 1995. And any political scientist would tell you that given all the anomalies about registering people, that's virtually 100% turnout. people thought life would be different tomorrow based on their vote, and they showed up to vote, right? And I think lots of people, if you live in our system, I have a good friend, teaches in Calgary. I think he's the only member of the NDP in Central Calgary. Rob Anders has been his MP, unfortunately won't be in the future. Why would my friend goes to vote? Because he's a social studies teacher. He doesn't have any option, you know, it's just inbred duty. But why would he? Right? In our system, why would he? Other than the fact that he feels some sense of obligation. Right? So there are issues with the system as well as with the book. So I'm not advocating for this kind of consensus around crisis, but you read about it all the time. There's also a consensus about how to fix it. And the consensus is what I would call a civic Republican consensus. It's not called that in the literature. Citizenship educators are so divorced from political theory, it's not funny. They write it as if there was no kind of theoretical context to what they do. It's a civic Republican approach, and that's a small r Republican, for those of you that are worried, to citizenship, which emphasizes two things. Number one, agency, and number two, responsibility. Agency, I can make a difference. Individual people getting active can make a difference, and responsibility, they should, right? And so you'll see here the kind of different focus, and curricular focus is all down, ironically, the right-hand side of the screen for you, right? That's what official curriculums say. Now, the arrow at the top indicates a trend line, that the curriculum is trending this way. My colleague at OISE, Kathy Dickmore, has done a lot of exploring in her research about how citizenship education in practice is somewhat short of that right-hand side of the thing. But that's the trend line for the curriculum. But it's a trend line. The other exists still. These things play out together, right? So there's still a very significant move that citizenship education is about creating a single sense of national identity, a sense of social cohesion, a common understanding of the country, a common understanding of our history, and those kinds of things. That plays out. The last big foray into that was Jack Ranenstein's book in 1998, Who Killed Canadian History, but it shows up every once in a while, and it's shown up in attempted reforms by the federal, and actual reforms by the federal government to public history and public history institutions in Canada. Right, so these two things exist in tension, but the trend line in official curriculum is to this civic Republican approach in engagement. So the key question I have is, can we measure progress in citizenship and citizenship education? That's my role in this is I've written a paper, and if you want the longer paper, I can send you the paper. So it's written, and I'm going in November to present it at the kind of launch conference for People for Education. In citizenship, we often think about the great triad, the three things that we're trying to develop: knowledge, skills, and dispositions and values. That's been kind of the traditional way to think about that, and I'm trying to kind of break out of that traditional way a little bit and think about areas. In terms of the values and dispositions, there's been some very interesting work done looking at emerging democracies in Eastern Europe that have emerged since the fall of communism. And George Schulfin is one scholar I like to read, and he talks about first-order rules and second-order rules. And first-order rules in democracies are the structures, things like legislatures, electoral systems, courts of law, all of those kinds of institutional structures and processes that are put into place. But for him, the reasons that democracies struggle to take root and flourish is an issue with the second-order rules. These are the rules that he talks about up there of humility, of altruism, of commitment to working together even when we're making each other angry, the deeper kinds of things, right? And he's very interested in that. I am as well. I'm not going to talk anything about how to measure those things tonight, but just to let you know, they are on the radar. Now I want to come to the point where I have failed, where my colleagues have failed. We've been extraordinarily imprecise and vague in talking about citizenship and citizenship education. It's a slogan. It can mean anything to anybody, and it does. And scholars haven't had, people should engage, they should be active, they should participate. They should know things, but we're not very clear about what it is they should know. And we've been way behind our colleagues in history education who have seized the day in the last 15 or 20 years around the world and developed a burgeoning body of scholarship about and research, empirical research showing how young people and their teachers think about history and the learning of history. And they're way ahead of them. And some of the most interesting of that work is being done at the Center for the Study of Historical Consciousness at the University of British Columbia. And scholars there, led by Peter Seixas, have developed a framework for thinking about history and for framing the history curriculum and assessment. What is it when we want kids to know, and how are we going to assess it? And they've developed it around what they call 6 procedural concepts that historians work with in doing their work. It's kind of like pulling back the curtain. My quip is, we want children not only to know what historians know, we want them to think about how historians know. What are the processes by which historians make knowledge and communicate knowledge to each other? And we can engage, and there's all kinds of research that you can engage children, even very young children, in that work. Kate Ireland is a PhD student sitting there that did a phenomenal project with grade 1 students, teaching them Canadian immigration history. And one of the members of her committee, an ignorant slob, told her that grade 1 kids couldn't do what you wanted them to do, you better not do it, you better try grade 3. That would be me. And they did it. And I was angry because she proved they could do it, and over and against my advice. So I told her, well, you can do it. You love this stuff. You eat and breathe this stuff. So it was easy for you. But what about the kind of ordinary grade 1 teacher that's got all these other demands on his or her time and can't do it? And she said, she's taken up the challenge, and she's currently organizing her PhD study to look at that question. What do we need to do to mentor teachers to be able to do this? And so this has captured the field in history education around the world. There are different frameworks for historical thinking in different places, but they're all essentially the same, and they have become foundational to the curriculum. If you look at the curriculum documents in New Brunswick now, they all center the study of history around these 6 big ideas, helping kids become confident in working through these big ideas using historical material. They're in the New Brunswick curriculum, they're in the latest revisions of the Ontario curriculum, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and they have become, it's one of the ideas that's come from, if you like, from the academy, and we haven't done that in citizenship. We haven't articulated a set of key underlying principles or concepts or ideas that we might teach the kids. So here are 2 possible frameworks, and this is based on the idea that there are central core ideas that kind of undergird thinking about democracy and democratic citizenship. And students need to learn to wrestle with those ideas, to understand those ideas in deep and profound ways. And so I don't know what they are. We have to figure that out. But here's 2 suggestions. I worked on a project for a number of years with Russian teachers called the Spirit of Democracy Project. Colleagues and I here, you might think watching the news it didn't work. We're hopeful that this isn't the end of the story. This is a list of kind of foundational concepts that we were working with the Russian teachers to develop ways to teach about. The other one comes from a book by Paul Woodruff, a scholar at the University of Texas, called The First Democracy, talking about ancient Athens. And his argument is we shouldn't focus on processes and structures and institutions. We need to focus on underlying ideas. If you ask anybody now, if you ask children what they think democracy is, they say they think it's voting. The Athenians didn't like voting. They were very suspicious of voting because they figured voting could be corrupted in 2 ways, by money or by a silver-tongued devil. And so when they chose representatives, they voted for some things, but when they chose representatives, they chose them by lot. People's name went in a hat, and they picked it up. And that, but they thought was the most democratic way of choosing, because everyone has an equal right, equal chance to be chosen. And if you think about it, it also emphasizes, that's where civic republicanism comes from. It also emphasizes the idea of responsibility. I don't say to David, you go run and be an MLA and do all my work for me. My name's in the hat too. It might be my turn to take up that responsibility, right? Anyway, he talked about those principles. And I think we need to think through a set of underlying principles have profound ideas around which to hang the specific incidences of specific knowledge and skills and values that we're going to teach in citizenship education. Key to remember is that every important democratic idea is contested and fluid. We argue about what they mean and how they should be embodied or worked out, and they change over time. Right? It's varied across different ways of different contexts. Let me just give you an example of that. Almost everybody would agree that a core principle of democracy, demos peopleocracy rule, the people rule, is that the people rule. Well, that begs two questions. Who are the people that get to rule? Because no society includes everybody. Ancient Athens, which Woodruff called the first democracy, no women could participate, no non-citizens could participate, no slaves could participate. We wouldn't look at Athens today in a very favorable light in terms of democracy, right? But in Scotland, one of the big controversies was 16-year-old vote, and that was quite controversial. And I would advocate that for here. And we could have an argument about that because some of you will disagree. And the point is, who gets included in citizenship has been contested and worked out differently in different societies at different times in history. And it is worked out differently in different places today. So there is no right answer, if you will. The second thing about it is, it's not only who gets included that changes or is contested, it's how. Some societies still practice the kind of direct democracy that Athens practiced. Some practice first past the post electoral systems the way we did. Some use proportional representation, or Justin Trudeau apparently yesterday has promised a preferential ballot if the Liberals get elected. That's what the Australians use now for their House of Representatives or their House of Commons. Some places you rely on referenda a lot more than we do. If you're in the States, you know about things like Proposition 8, for example, which has been very controversial. That's a referendum, a citizen-driven referendum. One of the problems with schooling in many places in the United States is citizen tax revolts that drive referendums against the collecting of taxes for public goods like schooling. It's a different way to include the people. So it's a contested and fluid concept, and students have to learn it as a contested and fluid concept. Part of the problem with measuring is we fall into what Howard Gardner calls the correct answer compromise. And the correct answer compromise works like this. I will tell you a bunch of low-level, insignificant information, which you will repeat back to me, and we'll pretend you know something. And that's how much of schooling is. And I really like Gardner's notion of intelligence, that intelligence is the ability to take what you learn and apply it to solving problems in a new context that you didn't anticipate. I think that's essential for citizens, to take what they learn and apply it in the give and take of civic life as they move forward. So I would argue that if you go back to this, providing the definition doesn't indicate understanding. So if we were going to assess for understanding of important democratic concepts, what would we be looking for? And I want to make an argument for kind of a four-stage or five-stage process. That if someone would demonstrate understanding by setting out the critical attributes of the kind of definition of the thing, but then by describing how the concept or idea has been manifest across time and context. Gillian Thompson walked in tonight and said she's interested in citizenship in the Renaissance. It kind of disappeared. I would argue after the classical era at Athens. Somebody might argue after the fall of the Republic in Rome. And it shows up again in the Italian city-states. So how does it show up? Who gets included? How do they get included? How do they work? How does it show up around the world today? You want to talk about citizenship and human rights? You can look at the French and American model of rights, which is rooted in individualism and liberalism, which accords no notion of collective or group rights. You can look at the Canadian manifestation of rights in the Charter, which acknowledges group rights, not just Aboriginal peoples and treaty rights and minority language rights. Or you could look at the Banjul Charter, which is an African human rights instrument that talks about things like the rights of people groups and the right to particular social welfare provisions. So people take the idea of human rights, which is a fundamental underlying principle of democracy, and they work it out differently. And so for a student to be educated about that, they have to know something about that range of ways people think about this. I think they have to describe how the context or ideas manifest in their own time, as well as across time. So how does it show up now? And more importantly, what are the tensions, the positions and the possibilities now, right? That we could do things differently. That there are tension points around the big issues. Do you have a right to die? To choose your own time and method of death? That's an argument, a human rights argument we're having right now. That's one of the tension points. Who owns the land? That's a tension point. Students have to understand where those points are, where those points of tensions are, where those points of contest are. And finally, a person is educated when they can take a position. And I would argue when they can take a tentative position, because I think all democratic positions should be tentative. I think the fundamental underlying democratic value, if you like, or disposition is humility. The acknowledgement that other people might be right and I might be wrong. We do have to take positions. But you want to know something? There is no position on any important social issue ever that satisfies everyone and works for all time. So our positions had better be tentative ones. And I think if we're going to assess students' understandings, that we would assess them in this kind of way. Do they understand how the thing has been manifest over time and across context? Do they understand the points of tension and contest in those things? Can they articulate a well-formed position for themselves at this time? Now I want to move on, and I'm conscious of the time. This is, most of this is old school. Participation is at the center of curriculum, right? As Keith Barton points out here. We want the engaged, participating citizens, but we don't say much about what that means. And when we're confused about it, and it strikes me that participation is multifaceted and complex, and we ought to teach it as if it was. And one thing we almost never teach about, when we do research with people about democratic participation, we do a very interesting thing. We show them a whole bunch of pictures in one of our people participating in different ways. And they separate them out almost immediately. Almost every single participant separates them out. And they put on one side all of the things that have to do with our formal political system. Voting, running for office, joining a political party. They put it on one side. And they put everything else, protests, working in a food bank, everything else they put over on the other side. And they say, this is politics, and this isn't. That's one of the things they say. And they also say, here's where I belong. Here's where I participate. Here's where I engage, not here. Now, I think there are several problems with that, because this is political. Right? Feminist writers about citizenship have been saying for years, this is old news, that this is political. And it should be understood as political, it should be taught as political. It shapes our common life together. It is very much political. I'm also worried about the fact that people would say that I have no part in this. It's kind of a double narrowing that both worries me, because if most citizens say I have no part in this, who does? On the other hand, those of us concerned with citizenship education have almost taken no part in this. This hasn't been part of, we teach about this, and engagement is about politics in the formal sense. But most people are going to find their primary engagement, sometimes their whole engagement, in this. And we should be teaching them about it, teaching them that it's political, teaching them how it works, teaching them how it operates in society. So I'm not going to go through this in detail, but I propose that we begin to think about this as heuristic as participation takes place across a number of spheres. It takes place in the formal political sector. It takes place through political advocacy, which I define as attempts to influence that sector from outside of it, but direct attempts to lobby, to petition for political change. It takes place in civil society organizations, in groups like the Conservation Council, the Rotary Club, People for Education, you name it, in the kind of ongoing associations, non-governmental associations we have. And it takes place through grassroots community action. And what I mean by that are things that aren't so ongoing as the civil society ones, things that spontaneously come together, or someone doesn't join the organization but joins for a particular campaign and leaves. Now, obviously, like any heuristic, this doesn't work because they bleed together. Civil society groups try to influence the political system, formal politics, and politicians try to often work through civil society groups. So I do understand that. But I think as young citizens, we don't do much teaching about these two areas in particular. There's a whole body of knowledge that goes with each one. How do these systems work? How do civil society groups shape our society? What do they do? If you want to work in the United States right now and understand education, you better understand what Diana Rabbits calls the Billionaires Boys Club. The Gates Foundation, the Walton Foundation, and the other foundations that are pouring millions of dollars into pet projects to shape education in a particular way. Same thing happens. You better understand People for Education, because they're raising $2.5 million to do this project. Is it what you want to happen? How do they influence schools? I don't know much about them. I never heard of them until they called me, but I do know the Minister of Education's coming to hear this stuff in November. So they've got contacts and they've raised a couple $1 million. So these groups work, they're important. Civil society groups are where people find their primary participation. And that's not a bad thing. It strikes me, I want to propose a kind of measurement on a portfolio basis, right? That's more for the citizen to think about and for teachers to think about on a formative basis than it is a summative assessment, but something like a civic engagement profile. I made this one up. This doesn't come from data, except this person is very much like the students that we've been interviewing in our project. They're very involved in community grassroots action. They have some involvement in civil society groups. They have virtually no involvement in political advocacy. They don't want to demonstrate. They don't want to advocate. They don't want to stick their heads up above the ground and be seen. Right? Now, what does a good citizen's profile look like? Oh, they'd be different, wouldn't they? You would expect different citizens to engage in different ways at different stages of their lives. People get pulled into and out of. David Kuhn, I'm going to pick on a politician here, but David's been involved in a civil society organization for years and not as a politician. He's changed his engagement. Something's happened in his life, right? His children are older, that's probably a factor. Things like that. People change, and that's what happens, they move in and out. So a profile might be different. It strikes me that I would worry, I might want a minimum participation. Like, I actually think people should vote, right? I always tell my students to not vote and tell their friends not to vote, because when they don't vote, we go back to those crises, the government panics and they give me all kinds of money to figure out why they don't vote. And then I tell them, I'm just kidding. Don't go tell anybody that the civics teachers don't want to vote. But I would want a minimal, but I would expect it to be different. The interesting thing about this is we could also apply it to schools. Some of the most interesting work in England is assessing schools for their democratic practice. Do schools engage with civil society groups? Do students have a chance to get to know civil society groups, to get to understand how they work, to get to participate in them? Do they get to do that? We're big on volunteering. How about this? Do schools connect with the formal political system, and how do they do it, right? We could do a profile of the school. So this is the profile of an actual citizen. I don't know what a good one would look like, but I know that across a person's lifespan it might change, and that good citizens will have different profiles. I think there would be a knowledge profile. This is the same citizen, by the way. It's curious, isn't it? How it's flipped. But the person actually learns almost nothing in school about the voluntary sector. How it works, what it sees its purposes as. If you ask them, I volunteer for the Cancer Society. What does the Cancer Society stand for? How does it influence policy about what cancers we do research on or not do research on, or what treatments we advocate or don't advocate? Do you know anything about that? Most of the students would say, well, no. I just volunteer to collect money for the Cancer Society. They're not at all involved in politics, but they know quite a bit about it because we teach about it. Right? And we teach a little bit about advocacy. If you take that grade 7 empowerment curriculum, you'll learn about Nellie McClung and the famous 5, Agnes McPhail, and you'll learn about key advocates. We teach a little bit about that. But I think our teaching is really unbalanced because we're not teaching about the areas of civic activity and engagement where most citizens will find their engagement worked out. And so that's one of the things that makes it apolitical for them, is they're not seeing its force in shaping our lives. That's what politics is. Politics is the negotiations that we go through to shape our common life. It isn't a set of institutions in Fredericton or Ottawa or Washington. Those institutions play a role, but it's a much bigger thing than that. And I think we need to be teaching students that. I want to close with a plea. And this may be a bit off track, but I'm angry at how little attention this stuff gets in school. These are the outcomes in the Atlantic Canada Foundation's document for social studies. Some of the outcomes for kids at the end of grade 6 or 11-year-olds. Now you can quibble. I actually don't think their outcomes are standards. I think they're something different. I think they're aspirational statements and they don't work very well with standards, but that's a debate I don't want to have. I can tell you that my research says that students aren't there. I can also tell you that my research says teachers aren't there. How about you? Are you there? Can you discuss why and how stereotyping, discrimination, and pressure to conform can emerge and how they affect an individual in a sophisticated way? Can you do that? Can you use examples of material and non-material elements of culture to explain the concept of culture? That's a pretty sophisticated thing. But I'm not here to tell you kids can't do them, because actually the research shows they can. They can. Properly taught, they can. And so I want to say to the person that's, and these things are important. These ideas, these concepts, these abilities underlie our ability to do politics together. We have important questions to solve around that cross ethnic and cultural lines. Should we have a charter of values in Quebec? Should we honor treaty rights in northern New Brunswick? How is it we live together as different peoples with different worldviews? These developing citizens who have these kinds of understandings undergirds those kinds of conversations. So someone would tell you that social studies or citizenship is not rocket science. You're darn right it's not rocket science. It's a hell of a lot harder than rocket science, because I would give you the premise that the physical laws that govern the chemistry and the physics that send projectiles into space are a lot more predictable and a lot less messy and complex than understanding these kinds of things. And we need to take them seriously in school. We need to send teachers in who are well prepared to work with their students in these areas. We need to send them in with good facilities and good curriculum materials and teaching materials. We need to provide in-service and education and a chance for them to develop. I'm angry because we are really concerned about international comparisons in some areas, but not others. We wrote this, my colleague Annie Hughes and I wrote this, not at the World Cup that just passed, but the World Cup before. And there was lots of angst that Canada never makes the World Cup and we're not prepared to make the World Cup. And you know why we don't make it? because we don't have the infrastructure to make it. We haven't put into place the capacity. We don't have the youth teams. We don't have the facilities. We don't have the coaches. Everybody will tell you. And other nations have built those, and they play. And our research says other nations are building them in the area of citizenship education, and they're playing, and we dabble. And I think that's an international comparison that should worry us. Thank you very much.
We do have time for a few questions if people are interested. Roger?
Thanks, Alan. That was really interesting. What's your take on Benjamin Barber's recent intervention into some of the issues you're talking about, namely that we should start to think of the city as a locus for democratic activity versus the nation state because it becomes so inefficient dealing with the things we're interested in. So for a student, to think of the notion of Canada would be, vacuous, but to think of the notion of Fredericton would be more tangible in some way. Are there educational possibilities there?
I think there are. I would quote Tip O'Neill, say all politics is local. People tend to engage around local things. I haven't read Barber's stuff on that. Benjamin Barber's been incredibly influential in this field, starting with his book Strong Democracy way back in the 80s and moving on. And he's a civic Republican, so he generally would be part of this underlying consensus. I think we have to find new ways to engage people directly in community. So I was encouraged by what he said. I mean, it says it in the context in Canada of what's going on in Toronto, and it makes you kind of pessimistic about cities and the role of cities in politics. But it's a great way to introduce kids. I mean, we teach the community in grade 3, and we just play with kids. We don't teach them anything serious. But all those things about civil society groups, they all operate at the community level. We could engage kids with those groups or with the city government, right? So I think there's all kinds of possibilities. Cities away where people, cities and towns are where people can get in and actually have influence, can meet the people involved. So there may be possibilities.
I'm going to get you to come and stand in the picture frame.
Supposed to be on TV.
Yeah. Thanks, Roger. Another question? Yes.
Thanks, Alan. That was a really interesting talk. I'm just wondering about your view on students and their sense of agency, and whether trying to build that isn't part of what education for citizenship is about. Because I do think you said that principles are more important than methods.
I can't hear if I go back.
Okay. Just have to speak very loudly. Yeah.
Oh, did you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh.
Well, I mean, I think we need to foster student agency. That's why I started with the story of Emile Cohen. There's all kinds of evidence that if students experience schools where their opinions are taken seriously, where they have mechanisms for expressing their opinions, where they see diverse materials, where they consider things from diverse points of view, that correlates very highly with things like a tendency to engage, to get involved with the community, to join groups, and do all of those things, right? So I think in that case, we teach very powerful lessons through the hidden curriculum, to the structures of schooling that mitigate against, as Stephen Lewis said, that the lessons we're teaching in class. One of the big things in my field is to promote agency as service learning. I'll go on record. I do not like service learning, because service learning is all about service and nothing about learning most of the time. I'm all for community engagement learning. I think there's learning that people do by engaging with the communities. And some of the things they do in service learning, I think service learning is way too narrow in very many ways. It doesn't flow from what kids are wrestling with and studying in the school. It's not set in an academic learning context, and they don't reflect on it. The worst possible example of service learning is the Ontario 40 hours of sign off. I mean, the other people we make do compulsory service are criminals.
But that's not really
It's part of the criminal justice system. We give people
Yeah.
compulsory community service. I have no trouble giving people compulsory learning in the community. I think we need to build partnerships with civil society organizations, with volunteer organizations, with political organizations. We're so afraid of that. I don't know if you remember last year the controversy about the grade 12 class that wanted to go and hear Justin Trudeau speak, and it was shut down. That was crazy. A good teacher taking students to a political rally is not a partisan activity. It's just the opposite. They're learning about partisan activities. I want those students to understand how they use music and pacing and juxtaposition to present Mr. Trudeau in a particular way. I want them to think about that and reflect upon that in terms of agency. So engaging with the community is really important. Schools need to build partnership with community organizations. They need to engage, but the focus is on, we're about learning, not about service. I'm a volunteer in the community. I don't object to people volunteering to do service, but that's not what schools are not there to provide. My wife and I were talking about this. We both volunteer at a local service agency, and theirs has been flooded with university and college students who are just told to go and volunteer. This is good citizenship, right? And they show up, hundreds of them, very irregularly. There's not much for them to do because they're all showing up at the same time, right? And it's not effective. And so I think if you hear the term service learning or compulsory volunteering or community, it has to be well thought out. And
have you followed the news in Fredericton about the 100 kids who care? The 100 kids who care, so they're getting all kinds of kids in a room to donate or to raise money.
Donate.
Yeah, to some organization.
There's 100 women kids.
Yeah. Have you seen that in the news?
I haven't seen it.
Oh, it's worth looking at in terms of your research.
I mean, let me tell you about two students that I talked to my interviews with the grade 12 students about participation. I've got one that kind of typifies a theme I have called the activist. And she belongs to all kinds of groups. She's active in protest, she's active in student government. She can articulate why she's there, what she's doing. She organized a PETA protest at the Kentucky Fried Chicken beside the high school where she goes. I think I'm giving away the high school where she goes already, right? And she knows what PETA is, she knows what the issues are, she's a vegan, she's living out her life in politics. A few minutes later, I interview another young woman who's her friend who's been at all the same protests. And I said, can you tell me what PETA is? No. Why do you go? I go because Sally's there and Jim's there, and she's going because her friends. It's a social thing. And so I immediately get pretty cynical about that. But I have to watch my cynicism because maybe she's there learning from Sally and Jim and everything else, right? So she's there as a social movement. Everybody going to get engaged is not going to get it, not going to be the activist. But then I interview a young man, and the way this breaks out on gender lines is really significant in our work, I think. I interview a young man, and what does he tell me? He knows all about this. He knows all the stuff the activist knows, but he's not there. He's not at the protest. Really interesting answer. I said, why aren't you engaged? Would you ever run for office? No, I'm going to be an engineer. That's the answer. I said, engineers don't run for office? Not this one. So you get the observer. And a lot of the kids are kind of falling into that. They know things, but it does break down. Interesting thing on gender, on the survey, 2,000 kids, we asked them all, one question we asked them, do you feel personally prepared to vote in a federal election? 67%, more than 2/3 of young men say, yep, I'm all good to go. 47% of young women say yes. We have two questions on the survey. A closed question on participation. Have you done that? Joined a volunteer group, done this, 8 different categories, and an open question at the end where they write down some of their involvements. On every measure, the young women are more involved, significantly more involved in the community than the young men. But the young women say that they're unprepared to vote. When we follow up with interviews, there's a huge around the concept of what it means to be qualified. Right? So the young women are less qualified to vote, but they're way less confident. They have a higher standard of qualification, I expect, and a lower sense of self-efficacy or agency or confidence. The young men are not deterred by not knowing much, right? But this is important because there's a growing body of work around the world showing this gender divide. And so Kim Campbell came out the other day and suggested a modification to the Canadian electoral system. I don't know if you heard, that every constituency have 2 candidates, one male and one female, 2 winners, two members, MLAs or MPs. And there have been all kinds of pseudo efforts and efforts by political parties to engage more women. New Brunswick, 48 MLAs, 48, right? 49, 8 women. And the only good thing about that is it's a higher percentage than last time because there were 8 women last time in 55 MLAs. But I think that the work around the world on citizenship education says that more than the structural barriers to women's participation, and those are real, there's a cognitive barrier, there's a frame, and education has to address that. And education has to address the frame for the young men as well, right? I mean, where does this confidence come from? You don't, so as teachers, we need to think about how is it we put disruptive events into the curriculum, into the lives of these students so that they begin to think about, surface these kinds of things and think about them. So agency is a very complicated thing, right? Linda?
Yeah, thanks, Alan. What about teacher agency? So I appreciate your concern about the curriculum.
Yeah.
But, as a teacher for a long time in the school system.
Yeah, and this is...
The curriculum was then, we did go on with our lives, right? So what about what do we know about teacher agency?
That's an incredibly important question. There's a whole body of work on this. The English, when they started the research, when they put into place the national curriculum in 2001, they paid for the national government to launch a bunch of things, but including a longitudinal study over 10 years. And they sent offset inspectors out to look at the citizenship things. And one of the things they looked at, one of the mandates in the law is that schools have to be more democratic places for students and teachers. And they actually do a ranking. The Ofsted report reports on your school, and it's got a quadrant of schools where democracy is not on the radar for students or teachers, around to a place where teachers feel included, where leadership is distributed, and that kind of thing. So, and that's happening. There's some look at that in the United States, but there's no look at that in Canada. We haven't done a thing about that in Canada. Even with kids, we haven't assessed. So when we talk about measuring for assessment, I'm going to Toronto in next month to make a big case is we should be assessing the schools as democratic places for teachers and students. But teachers have to step up too, right? Teachers often act like that they don't have agency when they might have more. Like we need to take up and take responsibility for our profession. I mean, our own view professionally is a natural evolution is to a self-governing. We need to become self-governing as a profession. We need a college where we take responsibility for setting our own standards of practice and maintaining, but that's a discussion for a whole other day. But the English, curiously enough, the English theory was you can't have democratic schools in places where teachers don't feel like they have, they don't feel like they have any agency in places that are shaped. So schools have what they call school governing boards, which are like a school board here, except that they function for individual schools. And the law now mandates both teacher and student representation on those boards. And they put into place structures to help mentor teachers and students in particular to not feel overwhelmed by the people on the board, maybe perhaps with more experience on these kinds of things, right? To try to help them actually. So they are thinking about, if you like, democratic schools. Janice.
As usual, my thoughts are not well articulated, so I'm just going to start.
I'm going to have to move out of camera range.
Yeah.
So I guess what I'm wondering is how you prevent, okay, let me back up. What about the sort of big picture of the actual purpose of education to develop citizenship? So citizenship is the goal of education, not a set of learning outcomes within a social studies curriculum. And I'm wondering, I'm trying to think back, it's too long, I can't remember my education history. But at some point, I'm thinking that citizenship used to be the goal of educating, and that at some point it stopped being that we became training workers instead of actually, developing citizens. Now, I may have just made that up, but
Sounds good to us.
what I'm thinking is that a citizen needs literacy.
In terms of the
A citizen needs numeracy, and a citizen needs all those other things. You see what I'm getting at?
Yes.
It's sort of like, what is a citizen, and how does the education system shape a citizen? and it includes all this stuff, including
Well,
the things we measure and the things we don't.
here's the way I would think of it. I think you're right. And one of the ways I think higher education, if I might use that context a bit, has lost its way is we've lost a sense of what the public purpose of it is.
Right.
It's interesting, the great debate in education about private versus public is all about who pays. But private and public is more than who pays. It's what it's for. Does the institution have public purposes? And I think we fund public institutions because they have public purposes, not private purposes. I mean, obviously education fulfills a private purpose. It's self-fulfilling, it helps me get a job, it helps me live a better life, right? As my son says who teaches classics, you want to see somebody who's under attack in terms of being useless. And then he says, I want people to be able to live inside their heads happily for the next 60 years that they inhabit the earth, right? To have important things to think about and that kind of thing. Well, I think UNB should ask the question, what is the public purpose of a public institution? And everyone in it should ask that question. So my question as I come to work every day, what is the public purpose of my teaching, my scholarship? The professor in engineering should ask that, and the students should be asking that question. What is the public purpose of my degree? And you see flashes of that. You see Engineers Without Borders, right? Student groups like Engineers Without Borders, or student groups that set up advocacy groups on campus for various things, right? And they're thinking about themselves as being here for a public purpose, that their education prepares them for something bigger than 30 years of work and a pension. And so I think we need to expand the debate about public and private to say that it's not only about who pays, because lots of private places have really interesting public purposes, have a deep sense. Sometimes that public purpose is kind of a noblesse oblige and more than a bit elitist, but there is this infused sense of before coming here, our son taught at a private college, a small private liberal arts college in Indiana, and the ethos of the place, not only on its website, but the ethos of the place was that it had a public purpose. It was preparing people to do bigger things than just work for themselves. And so I think we need to think about that in education, that public institutions. When Frank McKenna cut out school boards and replaced them with parent advisory committees, I think the public debate on that missed the really insidious part of that. Because Frank McKenna's logic was, well, who should be concerned about education but parents? But that, again, what I said about politicians, they love to truncate the people they have to be accountable to. So if I can tell people whose kids are finished school, or people whose kids aren't in school, or people who don't have children, that you don't have any, the education system shouldn't matter to you, it only matters to parents. Well, it doesn't matter. We set up public schools because they matter to everyone. And so that's why I thought the elimination of school boards, where everybody could participate, sent a bad signal. It sent a signal that these are private institutions that serve the good of people who have children in school. And they don't serve the broader public good. I think that's one of the reasons we lose out in the debate against healthcare, because we have a hard time making the case that this is a public good for everyone. Everybody gets that about healthcare, right? For some reason, they're either in the system, or their parents are in the system, or their children are in the system, and they get it. But we need to make that clear. About education is a public good, and sometimes it's often a public good even when it's provided privately.
Can I ask you a question?
When are you going to shut up?
No, I'm going to go back to something that's much more practical. It's about the actual study and this measuring what matters. So you said that there's those political, your heuristic thing, and these groups are over on this side, but they're still very political. So People for Education, they've declared that this is something that matters. So is there measuring? Why are they measuring it? Is it to show that it really does matter, or are they showing? I'm not sure what they're going to measure. Because we talked before about how complex teaching and learning is, and the language of teaching can't really be measured by policies and tests and those kinds of things. So I'm wondering what the political agenda is behind this.
The political agenda, as I understand it, is to raise the profile of the things that they've identified as important, and to begin a public discussion. So the website's public, they've done a survey, they've invited people to this conference. They want the public to engage, talk about these things as important outcomes of schooling, and put on the radar that schooling is a broader thing than sometimes we think it is. I actually think we can assess progress. I would like to help teachers in schools think about those questions about what does a good engagement profile look like? One of the things I'm thinking about here is, I said that people will engage in different ways, and that those things will follow life cycle patterns. We know that about voting, for example. Voting has always been down with young people because they're not connected to the system in ways that they're often transient. They don't have a place to live. They don't have children in schools. They don't have parents in the healthcare system. They're not paying high levels of tax or income tax. So the things that connect them to the formal political world that make them want to vote aren't as heavy as they are for someone in my situation. So those life cycle patterns always work. People will choose to engage, for example, in civil society. I think education should give them, and this is a physics principle I want to get right, the latent ability to engage in all the other ones. So when they leave school, they should be prepared to engage in the formal political system, with the knowledge and skills and things that they have. They may not engage there, but can we assess their latent ability so that they could pick it up and engage in it?
Can I ask this, are they not giving in to the accountability gods here? I know I'm one of those people who hates that word measurement, and instead call it what matters in school, instead of measuring what matters.
I think there is a bit of
And
giving
better,
in. Yeah, I do.
I mean, that may not be the perfect thing, but it's really not just about measuring it. It's about describing ways that it happens and advancing the idea, because I think it's a really important thing. I think it does matter, but I'm not sure that measuring what matters is the most politically astute way of describing it.
That's one of the worries I have, yes.
Let's have one last question. That's okay.
Okay, it was on the same idea, actually. I was thinking a lot about this idea that you want to measure, and I was just during your lecture, I kept coming back to this one project my world issues class ran, where these kids, they really got excited about water issues in the world. They decided they wanted to teach the rest of the kids in the school and the middle school. They're gonna have a big water fair, and I let them create their own rubric, because they were all doing different things, and I had no idea quite what to do with them. And leaving them to their own devices, they came up with a rubric where the top strand was, they called it passion and caring, and that you had to prove, and they said you had to show that you've learned enough about it to really care about it. And it was a turning around of the wording that was really interesting to me. And it's interesting because I've always been afraid to put it on a rubric since. And I let the kids self-evaluate that, and they came in very honestly on it. So there's something about getting to that point where the kids are that engaged where I hate the idea of putting a number on it. So,
well, who said anything about a number, but you've just done an assessment of it right here in front of us.
Yeah.
well, oh yes, no, I know.
You've assessed it, you said it's good and it's powerful and it
It
does certain
was.
things to kids. And so you can measure or assess without putting in, I don't want numbers, I don't know.
Yes, well, but in the end, it's my job.
That's why I showed those pictures of those profiles, I don't want numbers.
Yeah.
Okay,
But that's it. I see
Yeah.
the word measuring, and I can't take the numbers of it in my head.
But you just provided an assessment, you just described to me why you think it works,
Mhm.
some of the things you think it demonstrates about
So
student learning.
is
So
there-
we can do assessment in that way. Listen, it's the political will, folks. We send people, you say, well, we could interview people and find out. We say, well, you can't do that, you can't afford that. We darn well can if they're in French immersion. Right? We send interviewers out from the province that talk to everybody that's in French immersion to find out what their level of French is. You can do that in citizenship. You can. We don't, because we don't think it's important. Right? So don't tell me you can't measure qualitatively because it takes extra time and it's more complex. Sure, it takes extra time and it's more complex. You can do it, but you do have to pay for it. There's no doubt about that. And the ways to pay for it in money, and you have to pay for it in person's time. But you can assess people on bigger things than giving them putting them in the fourth quadrille or whatever the things are, right? So I'm worried about the word, like you. I said that at the beginning. I am not worried about the principle of trying to assess how the kids are making progress and how we as institutions make progress. I think we can do that, right? I think we actually have to do that. To do that, and I would like to be accountable to ourselves for
Yes, yeah.
right? And that's why I want a college of teachers, because it makes the profession accountable to ourselves, to us. We become the profession, right? We're not regulated by a government that tells us what the standards of teaching are. That we work it out together, and that's complicated and that's messy, and that's what makes it right, I think.
Roxanne, I cut you off. You had your hand up. I will let you have one last question.
Okay. I want to follow up actually on your comments. You had mentioned about the organization, so I have sort of two questions. But before I do, I want to thank you. It's been a very passionate and wonderful delivered lecture. Thank you.
Thank you.
My question is, one, how old is People for Education? And two, you talked about funding. I'm assuming that that's federal funding.
No.
But my question is, what kind of buy-in do you have from the provinces in allowing you to collect this data?
Yeah, there's the,
I'm going to the website, because the website has some of the funders right on it.
Because it's really powerful work that you're doing.
I think
And
they
so
were
from government funding, where's it coming from?
There were a bunch of foundations in the Ontario government listed on one of the sites here the other day. I saw it. I meant to, right
yeah,
there.
there.
So there's at least some of the funding there. So as far as I know, there are no federal dollars. The Ministry of Education of Ontario is involved, and various foundations.
So
And those kinds of things. So, and they have a webpage, you can donate to the organization. How old are they? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question.
And do you think that the other provinces are going to allow you to have access to collect the data? So we hope so.
Oh, we're not even close to that, and I don't know. I think I'm the only non-Ontarian. If you look at except Charles Hungerleiter isn't, but if you look at the team for the leads on the thing, well, Kadri Erickson's not. She's at UBC, but the rest I think are from Ontario.
Well, I'm glad you're there then.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, so you can take a look. I actually think I appreciate the NGO sector in terms of think tanks generating things like the Conservation Council here, the Center for Policy Alternatives, and People for Education that tend to come, for lack of a better expression, from the left of the spectrum, but also their think tanks, Fraser Institute, the Atlantic Institute for Market Studies. I think that these are organizations that provide contribute to public discussion in democracies, and so that they're an important vehicle. Everything shouldn't come from the state, I guess. Something should come from the private or the NGO sector rather than saying private sector, non-governmental sector.
Thanks. So following this, please join us downstairs. If you have more questions that you want to ask Alan individually, we're downstairs in room 225. There's some food down there and something cool to drink, I think. So do join us, and really want to thank you, Alan, as always. You're going to make me stay awake again tonight. Every time I talk with Alan for a long time, I'm stirring about all the things, and I know lots of the students up there are saying the same thing, because you always inspire us to think about more and better ways of reaching students, engaging students, and making schooling more about education than schooling. So I thank you.
Thank you.
And here's our
Thank you all very much for coming and asking questions.
Yeah. So do come and join us downstairs. Thank you.